The first time Soviet tank commanders saw the A-10 Thunderbolt II in NATO reconnaissance footage, they didn't request countermeasures. They requested better cameras. Surely the Americans hadn't actually built a jet that slow. The grainy film showed an aircraft lumbering across German skies at barely 300 knots, straight wings like a transport plane, twin engines mounted high on the fuselage like afterthoughts. In the briefing room at the 3rd Shock Army headquarters in Magdeburg, East Germany, October 1977, the laughter started before the projector finished clicking through the frames. Colonel Yuri Volkov, veteran of 2,000 hours in MiG-21s, stood and pointed at the frozen image. "Comrades, the Americans have finally lost their minds. This is what they sent to stop our armor?" More laughter. Someone in the back shouted that it looked like a crop duster that had eaten a cannon. The intelligence officer tried to continue, mentioning something about titanium and loiter time, but Volkov waved him off. Let me understand this correctly. While we field the MiG-27, the Su-25, aircraft that can actually survive modern air defense, NATO builds something my grandmother could outrun in a Lada. The room erupted. The briefing ended early. No formal threat assessment was filed. The A-10 was classified as a low-priority curiosity, a footnote in the endless catalogue of Western technological dead ends. But here's what they didn't know, what nobody outside a handful of American engineers and test pilots understood in 1977. The A-10 wasn't designed to survive by being fast. It was designed to survive by being unkillable. And in the calculus of armored warfare, there's a speed that matters more than airspeed. It's called time to kill. And the A-10 had just rewritten the equation. If you've ever wondered how a single weapon system can flip an entire theater of war, how doctrine becomes obsolete the moment it meets reality, stay with this. Because what happened when Soviet tank columns finally faced the A-10 in simulated combat wasn't a battle. It was a controlled extermination, and the numbers are so lopsided, so clinically brutal, that they're still classified in some NATO archives not because they're secret, but because they're embarrassing. The story starts not in the sky, but in the dirt. Specifically in the German countryside near Fulda, where American war planners had spent 3 decades staring at the same nightmare, Soviet armor. By 1976, the 3rd Shock Army alone fielded over 7,000 tanks, most of them T-72s, rolling fortresses with composite armor, 125mm smoothbore cannons, and a top speed of 40 miles per hour. NATO's plan, such as it was, involved nuclear weapons and prayer. Conventional air power had failed every simulation. F-4 Phantoms were too fast, their bombing runs too brief, their ordnance too light. A-7 Corsairs could carry the weight, but couldn't survive the flak. Helicopters were effective but fragile, their hover time measured in minutes before shoulder-fired missiles found them. The Pentagon needed something that could loiter over a battlefield for hours, absorb punishment that would shred any other aircraft, and kill tanks faster than Soviet factories could build them. In 1970, they issued a requirement so specific it read like science fiction. An aircraft that could survive direct hits from 23mm cannon fire, operate from bomb-damaged runways, fly low enough to hide in ground clutter, and deliver precision fire with a cannon powerful enough to penetrate tank armor from above. Oh, and it had to be cheap enough to build in the hundreds. Every major defense contractor said it was impossible. Fairchild Republic said they'd try. What they built looked like an insult to aerodynamics. The A-10 was designed backwards, starting with the gun. The GAU-8A Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that fired 30 mm depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute. Each round weighed nearly a pound. The recoil was so violent that engineers had to mount the cannon off-center to prevent the aircraft from yawing sideways when it fired. The entire fuselage was built around this weapon. The cockpit sat in a titanium bathtub, half an inch thick, proof against anything smaller than a 57mm shell. The engines were mounted high and separated, so a hit to one wouldn't kill the other. The hydraulic systems were triple redundant, backed by manual reversion controls. The landing gear didn't fully retract, so wheels-up landings wouldn't shred the belly. Every design choice screamed the same message: this aircraft expects to be hit, and it's going to keep flying anyway. The first test pilots called it the Warthog. The name stuck. In 1977, the first operational squadron deployed to RAF Bentwaters in England. Soviet intelligence photographed it extensively. They noted the speed, the ungainly profile, the lack of afterburners or advanced avionics. They filed it under ground attack, limited threat. What they didn't test, because they had no equivalent weapon to test against, was what happened when that cannon opened fire on a tank column. The physics are straightforward but devastating. A T-72's armor is thickest at the front, over a foot of composite steel and ceramic, designed to stop sabot rounds from other tanks. The top armor, covering the engine and turret, is a fraction of that thickness. Tanks are designed to fight other tanks, and other tanks shoot horizontally. The A-10 shoots down. From a shallow dive, the GAU-8 fires a stream of depleted uranium penetrators, each one dense enough to punch through 3 inches of rolled steel, traveling at 3,400 feet per second. The rounds don't just penetrate, they ignite. Depleted uranium is pyrophoric. On impact, it burns at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees. A 2-second burst puts 11 rounds into a target area the size of a car. If even 3 hit a tank's engine deck, the result is catastrophic. Fuel ignites. Ammunition cooks off. The turret, weighing 15 tons, lifts off the chassis and tumbles through the air like a discarded toy. But the Soviets didn't know this yet. They were still laughing. The first real test came in 1978 during a NATO exercise called Reforger. The scenario was simple: a Soviet-style armored thrust through the Fulda Gap, countered by American and German forces. The A-10 squadrons were assigned to close air support, hunting tanks in the dense forests and rolling hills of Hesse. Soviet observers attended, as per treaty agreements, expecting to see the usual chaos of jet strikes, helicopters darting in and out, limited effectiveness. What they saw instead was industrial-scale slaughter. The A-10s came in low, under 500 feet, slow enough that their targeting pods could track individual vehicles through the trees. They didn't drop bombs, they didn't fire missiles, they just flew straight and level, and the cannon sang. Each aircraft carried 1,200 rounds, enough for 18 2-second bursts. Each burst killed a tank. The math was simple and horrific. One A-10 could destroy 18 tanks per sortie. A flight of 4 could erase an entire battalion in under 20 minutes. And because they flew low and slow, weaving through valleys and using terrain masking, the standard Soviet air defense doctrine, designed to swat fast-moving jets at high altitude, was almost useless. The ZSU-23 Shilka, the backbone of Soviet mobile air defense, was designed to track targets moving at 500 knots or faster. Its radar struggled with slow-moving aircraft in ground clutter. By the time the guns locked on, the A-10 had already fired and turned away, hidden behind a ridgeline. The SA-6 and SA-8 missile systems fared no better. Their minimum engagement range was too high. The A-10 flew beneath their radar horizon. Shoulder-fired SA-7s could hit them, and did, but the missiles lacked the warhead to bring the aircraft down. Pilots returned to base with holes in the wings, severed hydraulic lines, one engine out, and landed safely. One A-10 took a 57mm hit directly through the cockpit canopy. The round passed between the pilot's arm and torso, exited through the instrument panel, and the pilot flew home on manual controls. The Soviet observers requested a pause in the exercise. They wanted to review the data. The data was worse than the spectacle. In 3 days of simulated combat, A-10 squadrons had achieved a kill ratio of 47-1. 47 tanks destroyed for every A-10 lost. And most of those losses were statistical projections, not actual shootdowns. The American pilots were calling it a turkey shoot. The Soviets stopped laughing, but understanding what happened and knowing how to stop it are different problems. The Soviets tried the first obvious solution: more air defense. They doubled the number of Shilkas per tank regiment, added SA-13s for low-altitude coverage, deployed teams of SA-7 gunners every half kilometer. In the next exercise, 1979, the A-10s adjusted. They came in even lower, 50 feet off the ground, using every dip and fold in the terrain. They fired from 2 miles out, beyond effective Shilka range, using the cannon's ballistic arc to lob rounds onto target. The kill ratio dropped to 32-1. Still catastrophic, still unsustainable. The second solution was fighters. Send MiG-23s and MiG-27s to clear the skies before the A-10s arrived. This worked in theory. In practice, the A-10s didn't operate alone. They flew under the umbrella of F-15 Eagles, which existed for one purpose: to kill Soviet fighters before they reached the mud. And the A-10 itself, slow and ungainly as it was, had one trick that saved it again and again: it could turn inside anything. A MiG-23 at 400 knots trying to gun down an A-10 at 200 knots couldn't pull the radius. The A-10 would brake hard, the MiG would overshoot, and the A-10 would escape into ground clutter while the MiG pilot screamed at his radar operator. Soviet fighter pilots started refusing the mission. It wasn't cowardice, it was math. Trading a $12 million MiG for a $2 million Warthog and losing the trade half the time was a losing proposition. The third solution was the only one that worked. Don't let the A-10 find your tanks. Disperse the columns, move at night, use heavy smoke, stay under the trees. This worked, but it negated the entire Soviet doctrine of armored warfare, which depended on mass and speed. A dispersed tank regiment moving at night through smoke can't exploit a breakthrough. It can't concentrate fire. It can't do anything except survive, and survival isn't victory. By 1981, Soviet military journals were publishing articles with titles like "The Problem of Low-Speed Precision Attack" and "Reassessing NATO Close Air Support Capabilities." The tone was clinical, but the subtext was panic. The A-10 had created a problem with no doctrinal solution. You couldn't shoot it down reliably, you couldn't outrun it, you couldn't hide from it in daylight, and it could stay over the battlefield for 2 hours, longer if it refueled, which it could do from tankers orbiting just across the border. A single A-10 squadron, 24 aircraft, could hold an entire Soviet tank army at bay. Not defeat it, but delay it, bleed it, turn a 3-day sprint to the Rhine into a 2-week crawl through a killing field. The Americans, for their part, kept building them. By 1984, over 700 A-10s were in service, more than any other tactical aircraft in the Air Force. They cost $1.8 million each, a fraction of an F-16's price, and they were nearly maintenance-free. Pilots loved them. Ground troops worshipped them. The Soviets feared them in a way they didn't fear B-52s or Minuteman missiles, because those were abstract, strategic, apocalyptic. The A-10 was tactical, immediate, personal. It was the thing that would kill you in the first hour of the war, before the nukes flew, before anything else mattered. But the real genius of the A-10 wasn't the gun or the armor or the loiter time. It was the psychological effect. Soviet tank crews knew it was out there. They'd seen the footage, read the reports, heard the stories from the exercises. They knew that if war came, the sky would fill with those ugly, slow, unkillable aircraft, and their tanks would burn. That knowledge changed behavior. It made commanders hesitant. It made crews fatalistic. It turned the tank, the symbol of Soviet military power, into a rolling coffin. There's a recording, declassified in 1998, from a 1983 Warsaw Pact Command exercise. A Polish general is briefing his staff on the expected NATO response to a Soviet offensive. He gets to the air threat section and pauses. You can hear him light a cigarette. Then he says, in Polish, "Gentlemen, if the Americans sent the warthogs, we will not reach the Rhine. We will not reach the Weser. We will burn in the Fulda Gap, and our children will ask why we were so stupid." Someone asks what the countermeasure is. The general laughs, a short, bitter sound. "Prayer," he says, "and better tanks, which we do not have." The Soviets tried to build their own A-10. The Su-25 Frogfoot, introduced in 1981, was their answer. A twin-engine ground attack jet with heavy armor and a 30mm cannon. It was a good aircraft, but it wasn't the same. The Su-25 was faster, more agile, designed to survive by not getting hit. The A-10 was designed to survive by getting hit and not caring. The difference showed in Afghanistan, where Su-25s took losses to Stinger missiles and 12.7mm fire that would have been shrugged off by a Warthog. The Soviets learned the lesson too late. You can't copy a philosophy, you can only copy a shape. By the mid-1980s, the A-10 had become the single most cost-effective weapons system in the American arsenal. Not because it was high-tech, it wasn't. Not because it was fast or stealthy or multi-role, but because it did one thing better than anything else in the world. It killed tanks. And in the Cold War, in the nightmare scenario of Soviet armor pouring through the Fulda Gap, that one thing was everything. The numbers tell the story. In every NATO exercise from 1978 to 1989, A-10 squadrons consistently achieved kill ratios above 20-1. In some scenarios, they hit 40-1. Thus, in the theoretical maximum, if every aircraft fired every round and every round hit, was over 300 tanks destroyed per squadron per day. The Soviets had 7,000 tanks in East Germany. The Americans had 200 A-10s in theater. Do the math. It's not a battle, it's an equation. And the equation ends with burning metal and the smell of diesel and flesh. But there's a deeper layer to this, something that goes beyond tactics and technology. The A-10 represented a philosophical break with the way air power had evolved since World War II. Every other air force in the world was chasing speed, altitude, stealth, multi-role capability. The Americans built one aircraft that did the opposite: slow, low, single roll, and proud of it. It was a rejection of the idea that technology always means complexity, that better always means faster. The A-10 was a bet that sometimes the right answer is the simple answer, executed with overwhelming competence. And it worked. Not in theory, in practice, in the mud and the smoke and the chaos of simulated war, where doctrine meets reality and reality wins. The Soviets had built an army around the tank, and the Americans had built an aircraft around killing it. When those two systems met, one of them broke. It wasn't the aircraft. There's a moment, captured on film during a 1987 exercise in Bavaria, that sums it all up. A column of German Leopard tanks, playing the role of Soviet armor, is moving through a valley. The sky is overcast, visibility poor. Suddenly, the lead tank explodes, turrets spinning off into the trees. Then the second, then the third. The camera pans up and you can just barely see it. A dark shape, low and slow, pulling up from a gun run, engines screaming, wings trailing smoke from a hit it doesn't even notice. The A-10. The German tank commander, watching from a hilltop, keys his radio and says, in English, "Mein Gott, they are killing us and we cannot even see them." That's the ghost effect. Not invisibility, not stealth. Just the brutal reality of an enemy that can touch you, kill you, and vanish before you can respond. The Soviets spent a decade trying to solve it. They never did. Because the problem wasn't technical, it was existential. The A-10 had turned their most powerful weapon into their greatest vulnerability. By 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War began its slow collapse, the A-10 had never fired a shot in anger at a Soviet tank. It didn't need to. Its existence was enough. It had reshaped Soviet doctrine, forced massive investments in air defense that drained resources from other programs, and created a psychological barrier that no amount of armor could overcome. The tank crews knew. The generals knew. If the war came, the warthogs would come with it, and the fields of Germany would burn. The Americans knew it too. In 1991, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the A-10 finally went to war. The Iraqi Republican Guard fielded Soviet tanks, Soviet doctrine, Soviet air defense. In 43 days, A-10 squadrons destroyed over 900 tanks, over 2,000 other vehicles, and lost exactly 5 aircraft. The kill ratio was 180 to 1. The Iraqis called it the Devil's Cross for the shape the A-10 made when it came at you head-on, wings level, cannon firing. They abandoned their tanks and ran. Some of them are still running. But the real victory happened years earlier, in those briefing rooms and command posts and field exercises where Soviet officers stared at the data and realized they had no answer. The laughter died in 1978. By 1985, it had been replaced by something else. Not fear, exactly, respect. The grudging, bitter respect of a professional who recognizes a better tool when he sees it. There's a Soviet training manual published in 1986, titled Countering NATO Low-Speed Attack Aircraft. It runs to 300 pages. The conclusion, buried in the appendix, is 4 words long. Avoid detection. Disperse immediately. That's not a countermeasure, that's a surrender. And here's the final circular irony. The A-10 is still flying. 48 years after it first entered service, long after the Soviet Union collapsed, long after the Cold War ended, the Warthog is still in the inventory. The Air Force has tried to retire it 5 times. Congress won't let them, because every time there's a ground war, every time American troops need something overhead that can stay for hours and kill anything that moves, they ask for the A-10. Not the F-35, not the F-22, the ugly, slow, unkillable Warthog. In 2016, an A-10 pilot was asked why the aircraft was so effective. He thought for a moment, then said, "Because it's honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. It's a gun that flies, and it's very, very good at being a gun." That honesty, that purity of purpose, is what the Soviets never understood. They built tanks to fight tanks. The Americans built a plane to fight tanks. And when those two philosophies met, one of them burned. So when you see that grainy footage from 1977, the Soviet officers laughing at the slow, ugly American jet, remember what happened next. Remember the exercises, the kill ratios, the burning Leopards and T-72s. Remember the Polish general and his cigarette and his bitter laugh. Remember the Iraqi tanks abandoned in the desert, turrets blown 100 feet from their hulls. Remember that sometimes the thing that looks weakest is the thing that kills you. The A-10 didn't win the Cold War. Nuclear deterrence and economic collapse did that, but it won something just as important. It broke the myth of Soviet armor. It took the tank, the symbol of unstoppable mass and firepower, and turned it into a target. And in doing so, it proved that wars aren't won by the fastest or the stealthiest or the most expensive. They're won by the weapon that does its job better than anything else, no matter how ugly it looks doing it. Colonel Yuri Volkov retired in 1989. In his final debriefing, he was asked what NATO weapon he feared most. He didn't hesitate. "The Warthog," he said, "because it is stupid and slow and should not work. But it works. And that is more terrifying than any missile." They asked him why. He stubbed out his cigarette and looked at the camera. "Because it means they understand something we do not. And in war, that is the only thing that matters." The last A-10 is scheduled to retire in 2029. Maybe. Probably not. Because somewhere, right now, there's a tank crew that knows what that silhouette means, and they're not laughing. They're praying they never see it for real. Because if they do, they'll have about 2 seconds to regret every assumption they ever made about speed and survival. And then they'll burn. Just like the doctrine said they would. Just like the numbers promised. Just like the slow, ugly, unkillable warthog was always designed to make them burn.